Good afternoon, welcome back, and I hope you're all well fed and comfortable and tucking in for a little bit of story time, which is how we're going to start this particular segment. I'm going to go first. I think we decided on that. I think we did. I have to do the short straw. And I'm going to read you. You guys okay with story time? Okay, that was lame. You guys okay with story time? Yes. Awesome. We thought we would start out reading, much in the way that old marriage saying goes, something old, something new, and then get into our borrowing. With,
not the blue.
But not the blue. No blue.
Sorry, Sam.
No. We banned the porn. Well, it might get a little blue up here, you never know. I am going to read you a little passage, first off, from a play that you may or may not have heard of. It's by some guy that you may not or may not have heard of. His name was Shakespeare. And he wrote a little ditty from A Midsummer Night's Dream that goes something like this. These are the forgeries of jealousy, and never, since the middle summer spring, met we on hill, in dale, forest, or mead, by paved fountain or by rushy brook, or in the beached margent of the sea to dance our ringlets to the whistling wind, but with thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport. Therefore the winds, piping to us in vain, as in revenge, have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs, which, falling in the land, have every pelting river made so proud that they have overborne their continents. The oak hath therefore stretched his yoke in vain, the ploughman lost his sweat, and the green corn hath rotted ere his youth attained a beard. The fold stands empty in the drowned fields, the crows are fattened with a myriad flock, and the 9 men's morris is filled up with mud. The quaint mazes in the wanton green for lack of tread are undistinguishable. The human mortals want their winter here. No night is now with him or carol blessed, therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger, washes all the air that rheumatic diseases do abound, and through this distemperature we see the seasons alter. Hoary-headed frosts fall in the fresh lap of the crimson rose, and on old Hyam's thin and icy crown an odorous chaplet of sweet summer buds is, as in mockery, set. The spring, the summer, the childing autumn, angry winter change their wonted liveries, and the mazed world, by their increase, now knows not which is which. And this same progenies of evil comes from our debate, from our dissension. We are their parents and original. So speaketh Titania from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Piss her off. Something new. You may not have heard of this one. It is from Darklight, by somebody else. Friday, November 13th, 1903. The old man lay crumpled on the flagstones in front of a Park Avenue brownstone, his lifeblood oozing from 5 small holes in his neatly buttoned tweed vest, like sap from a maple tree tapped in spring. Standing over him, pistol still smoking in his fist, was a man with glassy eyes, vacant of rational thought. A thrall, thought the dying man, and he wondered briefly who among his kind had stooped so low to send the poor, mindless mortal slave to do their unpleasant bidding. The old man's eyes rolled upward, gazing past the face of the thrall into a sky so blue, so bright, it squeezed tears from the corners of his eyes. He remembered when he had first set foot in this world, and his was the first. Others from his realm had followed, but he had been the one to lead them there. He had been the foremost of the fair folk, the most powerful, the one to discover a passageway between the other realms and this one. He had created the 4 gates, one for each court of the other world, for each turning point of the seasons, doorways through which his kind could pass freely to savor the delights of this fresh, new world. That was in the days before mankind had stretched out his hand, before the forest had given way to the axe, before meadows had been paved over and rivers dammed. The old man had learned to live with humanity, and so had the fairy who'd followed him, finding ways to coexist in the same way that green things push their way up through cracks in the pavement. He had moved the gates from place to place over time for one reason or another, war or progress or plain old fairy boredom. And he could still remember when the mortal populace of this world had referred to the Beltane Gate as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That was before he had hidden it in the deep green forests of Ireland. The Lunasa Gate was still called Stonehenge, and most likely always would be. The Gate of Imbolc, now far in the north, had never had a human name, no matter where it had existed. Gwyn ap Nuith, the inscrutable king of the Court of Spring, had preferred it that way. Now, with the relocation of the Salween Gate, the old man had done his finest work. His creation would be marveled over by mortals of the New World for centuries to come, and even still they would never know its true purpose, that it housed a fairy secret, a portal to the other world. But they would flock to the gate, and they would call it by its human name, Central Park. Andrew. The old man blinked up at the tall figure silhouetted against the sky. Andrew, old friend. Ah, the old man gasped, struggling to rise up on one elbow. A trickle of crimson flowed from the corner of his mouth. You are here. Be still, Andrew. The tall man knelt on the sidewalk and put a gentle hand on the old man's bleeding chest. I will help you. Yes. Andrew Haswell Green, a philanthropist and a father of New York City, one of the driving forces behind the creation of Central Park, sighed contentedly. It is well that you are here. What can I do? Carry a burden for me. Anything. Thank you, old friend. Green put his hand on the other man's sun-browned brow. For a moment, the little grey courtyard in front of the brownstone lit up with warm, forest-dappled sunlight. The chilly November air filled with the heady scent of growth and harvest, fermentation and vegetal decay. The other man gasped and his eyes went wide, but he did not flinch or pull away. The bestowing did not take long. When it was over, the other man laid his oldest friend down gently on the stones and stood. Then he turned and walked north, past the ornate edifice of Grand Central Terminal in the direction of the park, to where the trees now whispered his name. Now for the awesome. The awesome. I feel that I should have Lesley read my portions, including what I wrote, because, yes, I am not as trained in mellifluous as she. However,
she says I'm trained in mellifluous.
However, my old is older than hers. Mine is Homer, is Book 9 of the Odyssey. And it is very brief, and it goes like this. I was driven thence by foul winds for a space of 9 days upon the sea. But on the 10th day we reached the land of the lotus eaters, who live on a food that comes from a kind of flower. Here we landed to take in fresh water, and our crews got their midday meal on the shore near the ships. When they'd eaten and drunk, I sent 2 of my company to see what manner of men the people of the place might be. They started at once and went about among the lotus eaters, who did them no hurt, but gave them to eat of the lotus, which is so delicious that those who ate of it left off caring about home, and did not even want to go back and say what had happened to them, but were for staying and munching lotus with the lotus eaters without thinking further of their return. Nevertheless, though they wept bitterly, I forced them back to the ships and made them fast under the benches. Then I told the rest to go on board at once, lest any of them should taste of the lotus and leave off wanting to get home. So they took their places and smote the grey sea with their oars. Many, many, many years later, someone named Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote a poem called The Lotus Eaters, and I will only read the last stanza, because it is a nice little illustration of the continuum. The Homer to the Tennyson to the sweet, eventually. Such hubris, to use a mythological term. The Tennyson's the last stanza of the Lotus Eaters is, they sat them down upon the yellow sand, between the sun and moon upon the shore, and sweet it was to dream of fatherland, of child and wife and slave, but evermore most weary seemed the sea, weary the oar, weary the wandering fields of barren foam. Then someone said, we will return no more, and all at once they sang, our island home is far beyond the wave, we will no longer roam. I know, he's a lovely, lovely man. Well, I don't know if he's a lovely man. Anyway.
Large, cloudy beard, actually.
My own version of The Lotus Eaters, which in fact I incorporated without consciously remembering the Lotus Eaters, which is the nice thing about the inevitable borrowing from myth.
We'll get to that.
Yes, we'll get to that. I'm getting ahead of myself. Is something I have now lost. Isn't that funny? Here it is. Here it is. The protagonist's name is Jael. That is all you need to know. There was a time of quiet before the rains. Mornings with Salis and others watching the flatboats return, dark over silver. Days and nights shift, the water starred or white blazing, swelling in sleep and dusk. Sleep now as much as shonen, sleep through sunlight and stretching, walking down an afternoon violet. The cadence of speech slowing until words roll and fade away. The river's beauty and the blue of the fruit, Jael says in her new language, and the roundness in her mouth very soon is not strange. She repeats the words, murmurs them beneath the low red ceiling as Doran makes spirals on her skin and maybe listens. Sometimes Jael talks to Lallan or the old ones, and Doran is alone, but always the circle back, to clay walls, to desert sand that skitters over their feet and fills their outspread tangled hair. No fear and no urgency, and the circle seems closed, tenderness of eyes that do not look away. Moments unraveling, formless, until the clouds. That is the show.
I will gladly read your books for you if you will write mine for me.
I'm not kidding. So, that gives you a little taste of, I suppose, the Caitlin and Lesley traveling roadshow here with our books. We are both fantasy writers, in case you hadn't guessed or are in the wrong room. And no, not that kind of fantasy, just behave yourself over there. I keep telling you, that's the next theater over. You can hear the music. No, never mind. Caitlin and I are both fantasy authors, and we met years ago. Oh God, 2002 or 3, maybe 1. I don't know. It was many years ago. Many, at least 10.
We just put can you hear us both if we're just talking kind of like, let's come up to the microphone?
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Are we loud? No,
And sorry.
here we go. Okay. Caitlin and I met years ago at Astra, where I was an unagented, aspiring wannabe author, and you were very freshly almost about to be published. And we were introduced by the venerable Mark Asquith, I believe, who thought that we might have something in common. Little did he know.
Yeah.
Yes, and he said, I think you guys should talk. And so we sat down and realized that we were both very, very interested in the same things and the same sorts of, I don't even know how to say this, because we both write the same thing in very, very diametrically opposed and different ways. And we thought that we would talk to you guys a little bit about our experiences with approaching our subject matter and our experiences with not only writing it, but with the business itself and how that has gone and how we...
A funny thing happened to Lesley shortly, I don't know, a few years after this unagented business.
Like an agent.
Which was a very interesting thing happened to our careers.
And we decided that as similar as we are, and for anybody who's ever sat down with us in a bar, you know that we are pretty similar in strange ways. We tend to finish each other's sentences, we tend to talk over top of each other, much to the delight and or chagrin of most of you here who have ever experienced it. But as far as our writing goes, we have similar roots, and yet the tree went up and then branched off into entirely different directions.
I think the thing was a funny thing happened on the way to the ant booth.
Yes.
We went all weird.
And the ant flies disappeared. Have you seen them?
Yes.
Nobody has, and apparently they're us. I'm very interested in the way that you approach your entree into mythology, because we both grew up enthralled by myth, and as I'm sure a heck of a lot of you here are, otherwise why would you be here? Except you took a left turn at Albuquerque. We both grew up enthralled by mythology, and I know that for me, it started off that I was entranced by a particular book. I even remember what it was. When I was in grade school, it was the Dolores mythology books. Have any of you ever read those? Yes, okay, they're fantastic, and they just re-released the Norse mythology book. It was out of print forever, and you can actually buy it now. And I went out and bought it, and I looked at these illustrations of these Norse gods, and they're very cheerful illustrations, which is weird for an apocalyptic mythology.
but they're very sort of psychedelic and strange. And I realized that that book had imprinted, or I had imprinted on it. I'm not sure, what do ducklings do? Do they actually imprint? Yes, okay, good. I imprinted on that book and followed it around like it was my mother for a good couple of years. I was the only kid in my school who took that book out because I kept just renewing it. Week after week after week, the librarian just thought I was, well, never mind what the librarian thought of me. But with me, it started off with that visual representation of mythologies that was so weird and quirky, and when I bought the book again, I realized that I knew every single panel and every single weird little gnome face that had been drawn onto it. And so with me, it started with the visuals, and with you,
with me, it was very much in the oral tradition, and
probably cooler.
No, au contraire, again, diametric, but not one or the other. It was my father who was responsible for instilling in me a very profound love of Greek mythology, and this was done when I was too young to read, and was probably 3, 4, 5. They were bedtime stories. It was always dark. It was always just the voice, just my father's voice, which is he's a professor of classics. It's a very sonorous kind of voice. And it's funny that you say that the pictures in your books were actually unwontedly cheerful. And my father apparently, I realized later, did a good deal of editing. Sort of dad, my father who revels in darkness and revels in
Leda the Swan was a little
kind of, yeah, even Heracles. I mean, there are some things he glossed over, but the point is that the touchstones of my childhood were the Greek myths, and that, though I have a really terrible memory and will often forget a lot of details, it is amazing how much unconsciously I had brought with me from that. So yes, for me it was a very ephemeral but very profound listening experience when I was very young. But the imprinting, absolutely, and each of my books in their own ways, I think, gives evidence of said influence.
Well, I think the oral tradition thing is very strong because
I've read her stuff and it's awesome. If you haven't, just, what do you, get out of here, we'll wait. Go buy her books and come back.
Yeah, no, okay, do it afterwards. But, well, especially, telling is nothing if not a massive homage to the art of oral storytelling. I almost said something else entirely, but oral storytelling. I know, she's so innocent. Whereas, again, I think with me, I moved on from visuals, but still in a mythological way, to Shakespeare in grade 9. Again, I think because I spent so much time alone in the library with weird mythological books, I had no friends. So I started reading Shakespeare at an early age, and that got me tons of friends. So I spent a lot of time alone. But no, I was learning soliloquies when I was very young, and particularly the Shakespeare that appealed to me the most was, I think, the urban fantasies that Shakespeare was writing. I mean, let's face it, Shakespeare wrote the first young adult novel with Romeo and Juliet, really, and it's a comedy. I defy any of you here to tell me that it's not, based entirely on the vagaries and inadequacies of the Italian postal system. And the Elizabethan audience would have totally thought that those two damn kids had it coming to them, and laughed, I tell you. Seriously, structurally it's a comedy. I digress. I never do that. Yeah, but so his urban fantasies. Hamlet is an urban fantasy essentially. It's a ghost story set in the middle of a court. And Midsummer Night's Dream, which is the ultimate urban fantasy. It is the paranormal intruding on the city life, and vice versa when people transgress into places that they shouldn't. Is really what I guess what stuck in my imagination massively. And was the genesis of these 3 books.
Not just the genesis of those. When Lesley and I were first introduced, she was lugging about with her a very, very large manuscript, which I believe remains unpublished, which was a fresh take on King Arthur, which was also a crossing over tale and quite gritty and edgy. And what I always envied about that was her facility with, it's going to be a love fest, I can tell, but her facility with the contemporary and the transposing of the contemporary into the myth so seamlessly that it did take me back to childhood in a way that was quite unprecedented since then. But it was not published though.
Oh yeah, and no, it remains unpublished to this day, which is probably the best for now. My agent recently said, if you cut 200 pages out of this, we'll talk. And I was like, oh really? That's another book. Okay, good. I'll get right on that. Whereas when I read your stuff, again, this is the whole thing, we both are fascinated by the same mythologies, I tend to take those mythologies and I guess put them in a real world setting. You tend to take those mythologies and here's where we get to making up words. You mythologize.
I fantasize.
You
fantasticize.
You fantasticize. You mythologize. Actually, you mythologize them, which is actually I think the word that I came up with. Yes, I know. That's a perfectly cromulent word. You mythologize because you're taking mythology and you're even more Somebody help me out here. Okay. 3 syllables. Because what you meta-mythologize things. You take myths and you even more.
It's true. I do not.
Myth. Yeah.
That's from the Muppet movie.
That is the Muppet movie.
Yes.
Can't live with them.
We were going to sing it. We weren't. So the thing about I didn't even recognize, I mean, other than my first book being Homeric, I suppose, but in a Joseph Campbellian way. There is a quest. There is a character who is humble in origin, but her destiny, in fact, I sort of, I guess, transposed it a bit, subverted it a bit, and that she did not have, in fact, a grand destiny. But the structure is fairly mythic. The second, and I initially, when I first was talking to Lesley about it, I said the second has nothing to do, in fact, with mythology per se. It's but then,
which is a lot,
yeah,
because
so
it actually is the mythology of, and I mean you knew this when you were writing it.
Yes.
It is the actual realicization of. See, you guys can tick these off as we make them up.
That's right.
I also think Campbellian might count.
No. Joseph Campbell's big enough to have a word.
Sure.
Yeah.
He's got his own word. What you do with that second book is you are taking, of course, the mythology from the first book and actually turning it into a reality, but
deconstructing a myth. So, if in fact it is possible to be mythic in deconstructing your own myth, then that is what I did in the second book. But
which is sort of what I do.
Yes, exactly.
All the time. Exactly.
What in my third, which has just come out, and yes, it's available out there. It was a much more direct link between my mythic inspiration. It was in fact the closest to an inspiration I have had in terms of what's next. What do I write next? I had already had 2 myth-based books that had completely failed. I couldn't do it. I was so enamored of my Bronze Age Greece that and a fantasy that the desire to meld them became so great that the world toppled in on itself, and I had no characters left, and I was completely. I was sure I could never do it. However, I was having a conversation with a friend whose name was Cassandra, and she did not know the origin of her name. And I know, those of us here say, what?
Oh my God! What? And the normal people in the real world are
like what? Really? My name? So
pretty.
I said, no, here's the thing. You have this incredible, Apollo fell in love with this mortal, of course, as they were always doing, and he gave her all the wisdom of prophecy and of what was to come. She, of course, as mortals do, she spurned him, though he was presumably quite handsome and quite smart. And he said, fine, very well, you can keep the knowledge, but you will never be believed. When you prophesy, you will never be believed. And as I'm talking to her, I'm thinking that, what's fun about this is you could turn it around and have a character who is cursed to always see what is true, always tell lies, and always be believed. And how would that work? It's a slight, it's a little tweak of something that I've known forever. And it was the strangest moment because as I'm talking to her, I said, I think I could do something with this. This is my only aha moment. I've never had another one in writing. This was the closest thing, and it was embedded in that mythology, which I have so long. The more I try, it seems, the more I impose world building and things, the less I succeed. So this was a very organic moment that led to my third book, which in fact is successfully, thank God, was finished. But yes, I am so organic about the way I mythify, if you will, my myths, that again, your facility with the urban crossing over stuff is what I quite envy it. But what I also find funny is that you, I think, have your little epiphanies as you are building your mythic world.
I have this almost like this disorder. Okay.
Only one.
I'll talk about this one. The other ones I'll leave to your imagination. But I have this particular tick when I'm writing that I really like to take whatever mythology it is that I'm working on and hang it off of real world incidents or things that exist or something concrete that I can sort of hook whatever story it is that I'm telling on. When I started writing the Wondrous Strange trilogy, it's about an actress in an off Broadway production of Midsummer Night's Dream, strangely enough. who discovers that, in fact, Shakespeare wasn't making it up. Fairies have existed side by side with humanity for centuries, and she's, in fact, the daughter of the real King Oberon, and all of Central Park is a gateway to the other world, and it's opening. And the reason why, the whole idea of this came from a short story that I wrote where there was an actress in a production of Midsummer, and some of the fairy characters, Puck particularly, was actually just Puck. And so I'd written that short story, and I was sort of looking for a way to expand on that, and I was looking for a home to put it in. Because I needed, I thought I told you never told me.
It's weird.
Aliens. I needed a home to put it in. I needed a concrete place to put this story. And I went down to New York for the very first time to meet this agent, which is that had signed me on, and was trying to pitch something else entirely. And I went to Central Park. And instantly, irrevocably fell madly, madly, madly in love with the place. If you've read any of my stuff, you'll know that I have an unhealthy fixation with Central Park and all of the magic-iness of it. It's an extraordinary place. It shouldn't exist in my mind. That's, you know, that kind of real estate in the middle of that city is devoted to what is essentially a fairy playground. And one of the reasons why it worked so well for me is that, again, when I talk about hanging my stories off of these real-world little incidents, the little passage that I read you, what seems like so many years ago now, it is actually, when I was researching Central Park, I came across a very obscure figure who was somewhat instrumental in the park being realized in the way it is. He's this very, very little known public figure at the turn of the century named Andrew Haswell Green. And he was a father of New York City. He was actually, he was a philanthropist and incredibly wealthy. He was largely responsible for the creation of the boroughs and Central Park and a whole bunch of green space, and he was a conservationist. And nobody knows diddly about this guy in New York City. You talk about the people who were responsible for Central Park, it was like Calvert Olmsted. Yeah, but there was this guy, and he's got a bench tucked away somewhere in the park, and that's it. Nobody knows anything about him, except when I did a little, because I wanted to use the mythology of the Green Man in writing Wondrous Strange. And yeah, the Green Man is a prototypical fairy god figure, sort of like a proto-god, proto-fairy. That sounds just wrong in so many ways. Yes, but so I came across this figure named Andrew Green, and I was like, well, his last name is Green. Excellent. And I was like, wait a minute, Andrew, from the Greek, andros, meaning man. Well, okay then. And then the name Haswell is, I believe, from the Dutch and means from the wild, misty place. And I was like, okay, I got it already. I had a green man from the wild, misty place, and I was like, okay, well, let's see if I can, you know, weave this guy in just a little bit so I can have my little bit of reality that I can hang a bit of the story off of. And in fact, the entire thing became the underpinning for the whole trilogy because I found out that this poor son of a bitch, when he was in the 80s, was gunned down, for realsies, on the steps of his brownstone apartment in 1903 on Friday the 13th. I know. I was like, really? Am I on camera?
It wrote itself.
It did.
Practically wrote
It actually did. And it gets even better because he was gunned down by this crazed boiler worker. Really?
Redundant, really.
Okay, I know. And apparently in a case of mistaken identity, where he was like, he thought he was actually this young, hot guy that was messing around with this woman, and the woman who was apparently, oh great, you've got me doing this, that's awesome. And the woman was apparently some mysterious figure who was either like a maid, who'd made good, or an exotic princess from another land. And I'm like, I'm just checking off all the boxes. Who rode around in a black carriage in New York with the curtains drawn and was very exotic looking, and I was like, I have a dark lady. And a dead fairy god. Done! So that was delightful, and then as I did more and more research into Central Park, I kept finding all these weird little factoids about it and about New York City, and every time and the story that I'm writing now has got other just stuff that is embedded in in that city and in the architecture of that city. And this is the thing, is that we are not the...
It's all place. It's all place.
I'm all place-centric.
Which is sort of theory-ish in itself, is the power of place. And you start with it from here, and
I do.
Yes, it's quite amazing.
But for me, it's kind of cheating, because I take stuff that's already there and I just kind of go, yoink. And whereas, as in your case, you actually take these myths and you, as you say, you deconstruct them. You open them up and you get them all laid out like a frog, and then you take the stuff and then you build it back into like uber frog.
I would like to think that I was aware of the frog, but I'm never aware of the frog. I'm rarely, other than the Cassandra thing, I am not aware of the frog. But it does interest me that what is it though? I mean, here's what we do, here's how we do it. But why? Fantasy is so often accused of being the escape, the escape. We've already heard the word escapist used today. What is it about the turning back that is so important to us? Why do you bring it from the past to now? Why do I go into the meta myths? Why does it still matter? I mean, Joseph Campbell obviously made a living deconstructing this or constructing his own theories of this. But I do think, for me, it is really, really interesting to actually sit down and have to think about it, because so much of it is intuitive. But I think there's nostalgia would be something also with escapism probably sounds pejorative. Nostalgia. Oh, that's easy. It's sentimental. It's sort of a static.
I think we should actually reclaim the term
nostalgia. I know it's because the only other way I can put it is yearning. But this nostalgia, this personal for the child I was listening to myths in the dark. There's that. There's this cultural nostalgia for these myths that are touchstones for so many people. There's this yearning at all these different levels: self, society, art. And it's about connecting. Why is it still so compelling to me? Why do I turn back to go forward? It's this paradox. I think it's about connecting yourself on this continuum, and one's books obviously. But E.M. Forster, of course, has this lovely connect quote from Howard's End, which is only connect. I think I'm going to map. Only connect the passion and the prose, and both will be exalted. And I think that's actually most of it.
I think that is.
I think it is. But it is that idea of not the static nostalgia, but a dynamic, changing thing that you can do with the old forms, and building something new is invigorating, whether you do it in an urban setting, which I don't think is cheating at all. I think it's actually very hard to suspend disbelief.
Oh, thank you.
And turn a corner in Toronto and well, in New York, and there's. Yeah.
Well, but that is the thing. I was down there again this weekend, and I walked past the Rockefeller Center, where with the new trilogy that I'm writing now, I actually have to put one of my characters' offices in the Rockefeller Center, because you walk past it, and it's like, oh, look, a giant gold Prometheus.
Yes, he is.
That David Letterman was doing, skating around one day. It's everywhere you look in New York City, there's a gargoyle looking at you from a church corner, or there's a green man hiding in a bar, or there's all of these things that are actually ingrained in the architecture. And I think it's part of what you say about the cultural yearning to connect with mythology everywhere you go there, and even on the new buildings, because they continue that theme of incorporating these mythic images, these iconic things, and things hiding in the architecture all over the place. If you go to the Hudson Hotel, which is where I actually set a scene, because I walked into this hotel. It's a freaking hotel, okay? It's all modern and weird and crazy. And I walked in there and I was like, okay, because if a fairy queen's gonna own real estate in New York City and run a hotel, it's gonna be this place. Because the entire construction of the hotel itself is insanely mythic. The front desk is carved in the shape of this massive twisting tree that looks like Yggdrasil. It's like, oh, well, okay, well, there's the world tree, and then there's like a goat on the wall.
I was like, we all know that goats.
Well, yeah. So and so there's this I think this desire to actually just weave that stuff into the fabric of our lives. And I know for you, it's to go back to that when you were being told stories. For me, because I became an actor and I started actually telling stories. For me, I always wanted to be a storyteller. I always wanted to insert myself into that narrative. And like when I was doing Shakespeare, sure, I was telling somebody else's stories. Yeah, he's pretty good. That you're really good at Shakespeare. And then when I started writing books, I was telling my own stories. And then I was just stealing blatantly from Shakespeare to tell my own stories, because if you're going to thieve from somebody who's doing.
He thieved. I mean,
He
it's all
did.
a cycle. It's just, it's all it is.
It's the circle of
That's right.
theft.
Creative artistic theft.
Creative artistic theft. There you go.
Mythic plagiarism.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in that that's the way it affected the two of us. And I think, and again, something that's always fascinated me is that with fairy stories, which is where I wound up taking my stuff, is that the Celts, of course, believed in fairies. The Elizabethans believed in fairies. Shakespeare was the first to codify the sort of the whole fairy mythology. The Victorians, you couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting a fairy, painting a fairy, play a fairy ball, fairy photographs. Fairies. You know, everybody, like, it was this crazy fairy party. And then at the turn of the century, again, it was like somebody shut a door. And that was actually the second thing that made me stop and write these books. I was like, okay, it's like somebody shut, ooh, what if somebody did shut the door? Ooh, what if the door was opening again? What if the door was ajar? All that crap. And then
All that crap.
Wow.
Creative process.
Value my creative process right here on stage. And I think that's what it is. It's that urge to actually deconstruct the myths and then reconstruct them from the ground up. And you may not have been aware of the frog.
No, that frog is looming large, too large.
But that's what you're doing.
Exactly, and I think also formally, well, also I should say though, that within myth, and obviously in folklore too, there are just kick-ass good stories. I mean, it's not, we can get profound about it, and we can say there are all these levels of resonance that, you know, but really also, if you know the myth at anyone at the House of Atreus, the curse of the House of Atreus in ancient Greece, it's relentlessly horrible, and you have Atreus and his brother Thyestes, and Thyestes is sleeping with Atreus' wife. Atreus is the king, and he finds out, and what he does is invite his brother to a banquet and presents him with this wonderful feast, and Thyestes says, "This is great, this is delicious. What is this that you fed me?" And Atreus has some servants bring out some platters, and you can see this cinematically. You can see they take off the lids, and there are the upturned hands and heads of Thyestes' two twin boys, just staring. He's been eating his sons. And this is vile, and this my father did not tell me. This was not part of my lexicon as a child, but this is the curse that then leads to Agamemnon and Troy, and it's all...
And the Kennedys.
And the Kennedys, absolutely, yes. Thank you for that rapid fast forward. But the point is, it is all one thing leads to another. There's this fatalistic pressure, but there's also this incredibly wondrous, visceral. It's like Tarantino and Tennessee Williams get together and they have this dinner, and this is the tradition. It's exactly. And so you can't discount the fact that myth sticks around because it's just an awful lot of fun, and yes, and it resonates. And something about it, speaking of the House of Atreus and about tragedy, the form, and I was actually thinking, because of my esteemed husband's presentation this morning about free will and consciousness, and wasn't that nice? But what strikes me though, but what continues to resonate for me about tragedy, and yes, frankly, I can't help. It's dark. I'm not about the happy endings and never have been.
I am.
She is. So we can talk about that too. Yes, I'm not. I can't do it. Maybe yeah, when I was younger. But what's so wonderful about the tragic structure is that you know there is no hope for these people, the gods or fate or the wiring. It's already decided. They're reacting to something that it's done, but it's watching the characters react to the inevitability of their fate that is so poignant and so delicious. And to me, now, okay,
absolutely, no,
this is tragedy. This is what triggers my froggy crank. But
that's your froggy crank.
My froggy crank. Yes.
See, my froggy crank actually reacts to that particular stimulus in a slightly different, although connected way. In that my froggy crank struggles against that to the point where that my frog will pull out the happy ending, but there's always some kind of a thread of evisceration somewhere.
Is that a sequel thread or is that a real thread?
Yeah.
Is it something that is going to be ambiguous forever, or is it all going to end happily?
Well, see, are you talking about the end of this particular trilogy?
No, we don't want spoilers.
Okay.
No.
We don't. No spoilers, but there is a thread. Well, because I'm now writing the trilogy that's set in the same universe as the first Strange books. Yeah, I absolutely left a thread that was the tragic thread out of the happy frog thread. Are you guys following the frog? I don't know. What's going on? Yeah. There will. Are you gonna grab something? I can a diagram. Yes, frogs and porno frogs. Excellent, thank you. Yes, so my froggy thread led to a place which has now actually led to an even darker place.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and I'm actually not even entirely certain that all of this is going to turn out happily.
Which makes me very excited.
But I am hanging it off of real world things that I'm discovering even more about New York City, which is kind of cool.
There you go.
Yeah, there's some horrible things that happen back there. Yes, there's a million stories in the Naked City, and I've taken that guy's pants right off.
Wow.
How did I get there?
Again, with the Sandra should just keep her hands like that the entire time. There was something, of course, you lit on something there that I wanted to. Oh, the things about the Campbell and the structures of stories that. Fantasy is often, again, I'm a little defensive about how fantasy is constantly getting shat on for being escapist and fun and mindless, whereas other genres like science fiction or something, or certain kinds of science fiction are held up to be.
We don't have any of those people.
Not at all. No, there's no dichotomizing here at all. But as in a defense of fantasy and in defense of the tragic and mythic tragic form. I find it, I think in my third book, what I was trying to do, so often in fantasy, you have the person of humble beginnings whose fate, for it is deterministic, it is fatalistic, a lot of fantasy, epic fantasy especially, there's a prophecy, there's a destiny, there's everything's determined, but it's watching your little character make good and save the world. I mean, this is what, this is what, how many, facile fantasies are set up. What I prefer about the tragic motif is it is that struggle of there is no saving the world. There is no, and someone mentioned in an earlier discussion the idea not at the epic good versus evil, but at the character level of watching those struggles. And yes, the world may be implicated, and in my third book that is what happens. There are implications that are political and that are broader, but really it's just watching one woman just fight against something that she really isn't up to. And it's about choices, and in Greek tragedy especially, that was very important, is watching the mortals make their choices in the face of fate. And it's it's my, and this too I blame my father for it. It's because he was always.
Wait, he left out all the gory bits, and yet you are overcompensating.
I know,
putting all the gory bits back into the frog.
Exactly. That's really seepy frog. My father later on, as I grew up, began to reveal the depths of his own dark kind of this. Oh, the world is he went perhaps too far the one way, but I have certainly internalized perhaps the nuance of tragedy is more satisfying to me than of myth is more satisfying to me than the sunshine and light of the more.
Oh God! And I just called Romeo and Juliet a comedy.
You did.
Maybe we actually don't have anything in common at all. And we're just discovering it here in front of all of you. There's now a rift. This friendship is over.
I still like you. It's okay.
Everybody go home.
You gave me the frog.
No, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yeah. So it is kind of a mutual. It's a complete lack of. As you say, it's a shared language, but a completely different form.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we both read the same textbook, but I was apparently reading it upside down.
Come now.
No, I like that. I love that. I love the fact that actually this thing that we are both apparently since childhood obsessed with, and that, I mean, okay, let's face it, that is the wonder of mythology, is that you actually have this system. Many systems, but essentially it's the same story over and over again in many different mythologies. And you can tell that story from front to back to front, sideways, up and down, in completely different ways, and yet at its core it's fundamentally the same story.
That's what you're saying. It's the green story.
It is. Yeah.
And again the frog. But yeah. I'm curious to see if anyone who has
that could make any sense.
Well, no, it's read our. I mean, obviously, clearly, we were dealing with our own little self-created.
Yes, we're up in the bubble because I've read your stuff.
Yes,
you've read my stuff.
Yes, I have. Yes, including Arthur.
Yes.
But it does. What we should also touch on, because we have this stuff and we have our readers, we have our markets, we have our audiences. Our audiences are very different as well. Now, what has happened since you got your agent? Your brand of storytelling is extremely palatable right now. It is much sought after, and
good Lord, I hope so.
It really is. No, you should know this by now.
Yeah.
And can you know why? Can you say why? Is it the happy ending, or is it something more than that?
I actually don't think it's necessarily the happy ending. I think that obviously there is a resurgence in the reading of the fantastic amongst young people. Because for those of you who don't know and are just sitting up, over there watching the two of us up here and are like, who's the blonde and what has she done? I write for the young adult audience. Generally speaking, that's where they put me in the market. I don't care where they put me in the market. I don't care what age of people are reading me, but I am marketed as young adult. And there is a, for lack of a better term, shitload of young people reading books these days, and a lot of them are reading young adult paranormal on all scales, like good young adult paranormal, bad young, which shall remain nameless paranormal.
Oh, it's already been entered.
Really? Oh, yeah. Oh, thank God! I was afraid to call down the specter. Yeah. You all know what I'm talking about. Robert Pattinson has weird hair.
Sparkly hair.
On a desert island, forced to actually make a choice. I'm Team Jen. Oh, come on, you got a disco ball on one hand and a fuzzy puppy on the other? I'm going with the fuzzy puppy. Yes, and that's all I'm going to say about that. No, actually, God bless that woman, because
there are coattails.
I am coattailing up the wazoo. Up Stephanie Meyer's wazoo, I coattail. That is the first time I guarantee you that sentence has ever been said. That you can do apparently over there. Yes. So I am. This is one of the reasons. There was in the beginning there was the Rowling, and the Rowling was good-ish until those last couple books. But let's face it, she introduced. Thank you. Yes, a bunch of delightful young people who grew up to now be of the age to start reading my shit. So yay for the Rowling. And this Meyer came after her, and she is also doing the same thing. Because there was an appetite for this stuff suddenly again, and I don't know.
You think it went away? Really? Did it go away? Before Rowling, what was there? I mean,
before Rowling, there was oh God, there was Anne McCaffrey, and there was like all the people we were reading about. Mary Stewart. There was
Mary Stewart.
Oh, Mary Stewart. Oh, I give you a big white kiss, Mary Stewart.
T.H. White.
Yes, T.H. White. There was all the books that we were reading, but at the same time, there were children's books and there were adult books. And in Britain, they still haven't actually kind of gotten over that distinction yet. They don't know what the hell a young adult book is. They're like, we don't read yourself that. It's very confusing. So they don't buy them. But I honestly think that a lot of it had to do with the Rowling, really. That actually, it didn't go away, but she made it cool for adults to read this stuff again, which is a big thing. Even the fact that, and it was a very, very smart marketing decision on the part of her publisher to actually put the adult covers on the books that the adults could read on the train and not be, not have these silly little, incredibly colorful, childlike covers. So they started reading them, and then they told two friends, and it's that Fabergé commercial all over again. And then all of a sudden you have this massive explosion of people going, where the hell was this? Even though it was there all the time, all of a sudden I think there was that appetite for that again, and it is sort of a new thing again for a lot of people, not for us, because because I had no friends, and so I read all the stuff when I was a child.
Oh, I had friends though. Sorry. I would have been your friend too if I.
Oh, you were not.
I would. I would. Anyway.
So that's I think that's a lot of it. I will bow to market pressure and say that that's part of it, and I'm deeply grateful because now there are a ton of people out there who are actually getting book contracts, writing the kind of stuff that I want to read.
Okay, nice segue to my funny thing happened on the way out of. She got agented. I lost my agent over my third book.
Yes.
And I could not find a publisher.
Because your agent was dumb.
Well, yes, maybe he was a little dumb.
Tight t-shirt said dumb. Sorry.
But in terms of the market and in terms of the way we serve up our myths and the way we filter the folklore, I guess my love of tragedy perhaps took it a little too far into ChiZine territory for the.
And thank God for that.
And I am retrospectively, yes. I am delighted that they are, in fact, and here's the plug for them, that they are daring and appreciative enough to continue to publish or
well, and that's really important. And I don't think I think your agent, bless his little heart, wasn't perhaps as foresightful-ishness.
Well, we shall see. We shall see. The market is a funny place.
The market is a funny
place. And people have referred today already also to the movies and to the difference, the genre, the genre-heavy movies, and how myth and all the superhero movies and all the myth that's embedded in the pop culture references. But I do wonder where fantasy, a certain kind of fantasy, is going if it does not have the pop culture touchstone. What happens?
Yeah, because the pop culture Greek myths of today are in fact the Justice League.
Yeah.
Really, I mean,
it's a franchise now.
But that's fine because you have you've got your Greeks out there doing their thing, and then you've got your Norse gods quietly trying to dissect reality and frogs.
That was Thor.
We didn't plan the frog thing. No, we didn't even talk about it in our get together. But but you've got your much darker.
But then there was Thor, and Thor was not dark. But anyway,
Thor was not dark, but it was delightful and had Chris Hemsworth in it. So
fair enough.
I digress. Again.
Yeah. Will there always? Well, I guess the point about myth having staying power and the market being variable, that there will be moments when, yes, Harry Potter will be transcended, and there perhaps will be other moments when darker, stranger Cthulhu things will come back. You never know. It is true. It's true. And
I think you were at the forefront of that.
Thank you. The forefront of Cthulhu.
Again.
I'm very glad to do that. Now, and I think at this point we should hear from some people who have either read our books or never read our books, or on one side or the other of the mythic folkloric divide.
Certainly.
And it's always a divide.
Turning it over to you guys.
Wow. That's very dangerous.
I know. We're going to take Caitlin's eye out or something. Does anyone have any questions? Seriously. Yes.
One of the things you were talking about is that sense of inevitability in some of the stories that you have. And what it sort of struck me is the difference in the two story styles as the difference between fate and destiny. And I think that sort of captures an idea, so I was just wondering if you could comment on that in terms of what that means for your characters.
Well, you're hired to write copy for us. Fate and destiny. Better than we came up with actually for the title of this little talk, which actually probably should have been that. You know, I think that's a very
Caitlin and Lesley, fate or destiny. Yes. Well, and I don't. Question mark. I don't. You know. That's such a hard one. Thank you so much, Jeff. That again, we're laden with these words. Words are so loaded and so arbitrarily loaded that destiny evokes. And I'm not going to say it means. Destiny does evoke the epic fantasy tradition of a bold and always inevitably satisfactorily fulfilled prophecy. That destiny carries with it trumpets and much delayed satisfaction, but suffering to the point of redemption or whatever. Whereas fate
is funereal,
and not just that, but fate is arbitrary in a way, and certainly in the Greek way, in the tradition of the old tragedies. The fates were absolutely arbitrary and therefore quite terrifying in a way that destiny seems to be this sort of the Vaseline lens through which you see the character's future, but no, fate is something, and fatalism is something quite other, and fate is much more interesting to me. Again, that is.
Yes, there's no such word as destinalism.
No,
I think you can actually be fatalistic, whereas you cannot be destinyistic.
Or you can't
because you make it work.
There's also determinism, which is different from those other two as well. But that's a discussion for a Greek tragedy class, which this is not. So, but I appreciate the attempt to draw a distinction because that is very much what it is.
Yeah. Now, okay, so let's deconstruct something like let's say King Arthur. Is the Arthurian story a story of fate or a story of destiny? I'm asking because I don't know, or at least I'm not going to tell you.
Yeah.
What do you think? I think can you look at it both ways?
I think it's a tragic destiny. I mean, the essence to me is different is like you said, one is arbitrary and invariably horrible, whereas Destiny, even if you have a tragic ending for the main character, that can be a noble sacrifice.
Which
that can
exactly
be that
would be
great,
different.
you know,
Yeah.
you can have redemption on some level, whereas with Fate, there's no redemption.
No.
See, in fact, maybe the thread that, the frog thread that we were talking about in my first trilogy is I do in fact have a character who is kind of pissed off about the fact that he assumes that if something hadn't happened to him, he would have had a destiny.
You know, a lot of people,
And then he just kind of, and then he just kind of has a hey, yeah. And so he actually winds up doing something that gives him a fate because he expected that he always would have had a destiny. That's a little crazy. Yeah. And I can't actually say anything else without being horribly spoilery, so
there will be no spoilers.
We shall talk further. But yes.
Well, that's an interesting idea. Can you have a story where you have a character who has a destiny, but fate gets in the way?
Think examples? Yeah. I would say yes, because you know what, that tends to.
I actually think that's, you know what? I think, again, I'm going to go back because it's something I know, is I think in terms of the Arthurian, that's Mordred.
That's exactly what, yeah, exactly.
That's Mordred.
He had a destiny to become, Super King Big Nuts of England.
Super King Big Nuts. And his orchestra.
Yeah. An orchestra of knights around a nice round tambourine or something. But yeah, they got a bit wrong with the table. But tambourines are nice too.
Yeah.
But you get the idea that things are going well, and then suddenly brick wall and.
But at the same time, that's his perspective. Before he's even born, in fact, before Arthur's even born, if you were Merlin, you see fate at work.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think they're actually maybe two sides of a very kind of slippery coin. Well, yeah, I know. That's.
Yeah.
Just want to draw a very familiar example probably to a lot of us in Harry Potter, just looking at Harry Potter versus Neville Longbottom, where J.K. Rowling pretty much opposes destiny and fate in that, because it's presented as it could have been either one of them. But why was it not Neville?
That's a very good example. 12 points to Gryffindor. Speaking of arbitrary, come on, Dumbledore, you do your favorite. Oh man, like that's the thing that drives my boyfriend absolutely crazy in those movies. Is okay, are we gonna get 16 points? Hufflepuff thing at the end. And he was glad when that stopped. Yes.
In fantasy, we often see a plundering of material. Like, for example, the subject of this content is modern mythologies, mythologies being modernized. Can you comment on, for example, anything? There's always at least some issue of originality. Like, for example, this is an original fantasy, yet most of the time fantasy always have some variations of the previous themes. So, can you remark on anything, for example, producing fantasy with completely original elements that hasn't borrowed or adapted into previous themes?
What, that hasn't borrowed or adapted?
But that's what you do. Sort of. Okay.
Sort of. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That doesn't borrow anything. I don't know that there are any stories that exist anymore that haven't. Wait.
Oh, turn back.
Yeah. At one point, I think he's talking. I think he's talking.
Well,
to you.
You think my first one?
I
Possibly?
do, because you actually do write things that have tropes, but whereas flagrant theft. Like I'm stealing from every myth, folktale, fairy tale out there. I mean, I'm not only stealing from Celtic mythology. I'm stealing from Shakespeare's version of Celtic mythology, and my book is actually a quote from Shakespeare. So, yeah, rampant, blatant
neon
theft.
Neon.
Yeah, but I'm comfortable with that. But you, on the other hand, are actually creating whole cloth, your own mythology, which has resonance.
Well, I hope so.
No, but
it's not for me to say.
Of course, it has resonance. But is it?
It is interesting that I think certainly when I wrote my first one, I was reacting against many fantastical tropes that were just driving me around adult fantasy was making me crazy. This is 1991 or something, and I, again, won't name names because I don't remember them, but I was extremely frustrated that the leeching of wonder, of the reliance on stereotypes and the reliance on...
Tavern scene.
Tavern scene, exactly. I mean, I have a tavern scene,
so
I do, but I was conscious of it. It's a very interesting line to walk, because on the one hand, I wanted to subvert, I wanted to just punch the tropes out of the, in the nuts. In the mythic nuts. But that line between archetype and stereotype, I still fell back on, of course. And this is where narrative form is just so, it's universal, it's deeply ingrained. There was no way I was getting away from the familiar in the way I told the story, and telling it as an oral tale was, I guess, in a way, I had to look way back in order to divest the story of the stereotypes that were making me crazy in the stuff I was reading. So I was very deliberate about wanting to create something from whole cloth, about it being about wonder and about, and not about umlauts and capitals and long names with no vowels and lots of glossaries. And I didn't, that
and
kind
apostrophes.
Apostrophes, yeah. That kind of thing I was tired of, and I was tired of the endless, they call them saga puddings in Britain, the Robert Jordan-esque, I say, so as not to be hated by Robert Jordan fans who might be here, but I think it was, for me, far more, and also it was very autobiographical, it was also rooted in something deeply personal. So for me, the journey was both metaphoric and literal, and the mythic, I tried so hard not to borrow. I tried so hard that I think I might have tried too hard. It was the first novel, it was very earnest. I really took, it took 6 years because I was so afraid, I think, in many ways, of being redundant, and I was scared, and I was defiant, and I was very self-conscious about the prose and about the storytelling, but I do think that the effort was noble, that I was trying to do something that was entirely mine, though of course then it turns out I have lotus eaters, which, I read lotus eaters are fun.
So the answer to your question is yes,
well,
and
was
let you know.
Yeah. I prevaricate, I do. But I do think it's really hard to talk about any kind of fantasy without the sort of bedrock of myth or fable. It's difficult to do. Even if you depart from it, that's the bedrock that you're departing from. There's no way. There's no way to separate it, really. It's just what you, how far you stray and how deliberately. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, that was good.
You're a smart question. That sounds, it's just, I love smart
She
questions.
deals with a lot of teenage girls, I think. Not the teenage
I
girls.
do, no, they're just, but they're like, okay, is Sunny and Kelly? Yes, Sunny's hot. Get over it. I wrote it that way. I spent a lot of time with imaginary people in my head. I'm going to make them try. You totally do that. You have some of the hottest guys in your books.
But I never describe them. I don't think of them as, anyway.
You did too. Maybe I made that up.
She's projecting, but that's okay. They appreciate that. All right.
Anyone else? Yes.
Chris.
I've been thinking since Daniel's talk this morning about fairy tales, and I was thinking about the kind of normative element, right? That use the tale as an instruction piece, which very often you get reactions to when people want to weave it. You guys are talking about drawing on some traditions, particularly you look at the Homeric things, right? And there's a bunch of stuff in there about how to operate in the world, and frankly some qualities, heroic qualities that we don't recognize as much as maybe we should. In the cleverness of, say, something like Odysseus, right? Or the Arthurian tradition, which is kind of tied up in a lot of French romance stuff. How much do you think about when you're working those sort of statements, the below the story level, this is how you should live, this is how you should nobly struggle with the tragedy, this is why you should rage against the dying for life.
Yeah, folk tales as life instruction. I don't know that well, I must, because they're there and they're actually part of the as you say, the intrinsic structure of a lot of those tales. They were, okay, let's look at fairy tales, for example, like actual, not tales of fairy, but fairy tales. They were pretty much cautionary tales to a large degree, meant to frighten little children into doing things in proper fashion and also stay away from murky bodies of water frequently. folded into, you know, fairly terrifying bedtime stories, which your father excised all the terrifying from, God bless him. Well, yes. I think that stuff is there. I'm not necessarily conscious of using that kind of stuff when I tap into those particular stories, because I think that in the actual usage of that material, it sort of is a, especially if you're dealing with something like the Arthurian legends, it is how to live your life and not be an asshole and sleep with your best friend's wife because you'll cause the death of a kingdom, you jackass. Everything went sideways straight to the Castle Crapper. You know,
Don't sleep with your sister.
Well, or that, but he didn't know. There we go, fake destiny. And there you're operating on those two.
Ignorance is no excuse.
Yes, it is, officer.
There's also and then there's Oedipus too, and what happened. Yeah. I mean, it's just exactly the same structure.
It is, and those stories are actually instructions on how to live your life that you'll never actually be able to carry out because somebody will always queer the deal.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of dangerous to be. I think as modern writers, the idea that one can be didactic in that way, I think we're beyond that, and I don't.
Oh God, yes, I write for teens. If I tried to ever actually give them any kind of moral in a story, they eat my face. Yeah.
No, I'd like to think that while we draw on the richness and the archetypes of myth, we no longer require the less nuanced aspects. So we have applying them in modern narrative is actually the best of both worlds.
Yes.
Isn't it true though that by removing that sort of moral, ethical standpoint they were trying to move on, that you're in fact not actually you're taking something away from like the versions of that story? I mean, I think that the ethical stance they're trying to take on these things, the lessons they're trying to impart, or I mean, there's a point in the story. There's much of it.
I think at the character level, and here's where I go back to what it is about tragedy that I find so compelling, it is at the level of a character who is struggling, and we see how that character lives his or her life, and we make judgment. This is what the Greeks did. They took that beleaguered character and had the audience, that's what catharsis is. It's the pity, the fear, it's the connection between the audience and this character. I think at that level, yes, one does still honor the form of, you know, are these struggles worthy struggles? Are the sacrifices meaningful? And all of these definitions are wrapped up in, some are mythic and some are just, you know, we could talk about history, culture, and philosophy too. But so yes, I will say that again, organically maybe, not didactically, organically.
Yes.
That is what at the character level I am concerned with.
Sure, and again, because I'm falling back on that secondary step of Shakespeare. And the way that Shakespeare wrote for his audiences, and the way his audiences expected him to write for them, is that, especially in the tragedies, not even so much in the comedies, but especially in the tragedies, the audience expected the particular fate / destiny / whatever we've decided to call that. They expected the outcome to be that. You know, when the Edwardians started changing the ending of Romeo and Juliet so that Romeo and Juliet lived. Did they really? No. Oh my God! There was a version written in, I believe, the 18th century where Romeo and Juliet said, "I'm not dead yet." Yeah, not yet. No, don't. I'm feeling much better now. I'm gonna go for a walk. Be stone dead in a minute. Yeah, they actually rewrote the ending of Romeo and Juliet so that not only did Romeo and Juliet live, everybody lives. Mercutio, it's only a flesh wound. He actually gets up out of the tomb. Everybody, yeah, they actually do a parody of it in, oh my God, I can't remember. But it's horrifying. It's beyond horrifying. But in Shakespeare's England, the audience expected that Macbeth was going to get his comeuppance. As noble as whatever actor tried to portray him as, even in the end when he's like, fine, you know what, I embrace my destiny, I fucked up big time, and let's go. And he still struggles against it. If he lived, or crawled off stage or something, no, the head had to come out. And it was because that was what had to happen to a person who did those things. Romeo and Juliet had to die, not because it was a tragic love story, but because they were idiots. No, quite frankly, they were impulsive kids who were like, oh my God, this is so much. Why? And they're struggling against what their families have set out for them to do. They are acting in a way that is counter to what society has set up for them as parameters of leading a good life. It's not a tragic love story. It's a, well, yes, they got what they deserved. Let's go to the pub. That was the way that they looked at that, quite frankly, and there was no getting around that.
But this is what I mean about in our more nuanced, perhaps, world or understanding of stories. Sure. Does that message even still? Should it resonate? Should we actually? I mean, we're not supposed to think they're idiots. I think that idea of conforming to ridiculous societal ideas.
Well, we're not supposed to think they're idiots. They did back then. I mean, that's the thing, and I think that also. See, these stories, I mean, as much as fairy tales, as you say, and again, I make the distinction between fairy tales and folklore and mythology. And fairy tales, absolutely, with that moral center and everything else. I think that you look at the characters in fairy tales and you look at how they act, and sure, there's life lessons in there, but there's also well, yeah, but you just push that old woman into a fire pit and close the door. And sure, she was horrible, but why not, just put her under citizen's arrest and call the authorities to deal with, no, you're going to kill the bitch. And that's not, to me, a particularly moral lesson. Also, that like the ending, the original Grimm's Brothers ending of Cinderella, with the plucking out of the eyes and the dancing in the hot shoes until you die. Well, what happened to prison? Community service.
But this is where the difference between moral and moralizing comes
exactly.
in. I think that's what they were about, was moralizing, yes. not a strong moral sense.
Sure, absolutely. But again, it's like life lessons. Not really. No. I think you can extrapolate that from them, but at the same time, I think they are stories that don't necessarily tell you how to behave, and I don't think you're stripping anything out of that by not actually approaching them in that fashion. I could be wrong, and you're putting your hand back up, so I am.
Yeah, well, it's a follow-up question. I mean, you talk about stories where we look at the modern viewpoint and go, wow, that's really horrifying. Why didn't they just, call the cops? I was talking to a friend of mine who was, the idea that, we look at certain elements like the Bible, for example, where, during Sodom and Gomorrah, the guy's like, look, as long as you don't rape me, you can rape my daughters.
And really, he's got a point.
And to the modern, to the viewpoint of the time, that's heroic. To the modern viewpoint, that's completely horrifying. It's like a complete antithesis. Do you think there's some value in approaching those traditional tropes and turning them on their head to apply modern ethic to it, looking at it as a viewpoint? You see this with a lot of on the Arthurian stuff, where women are rewriting it as stories where women are the heroes and the guys are.
Well, and Daniel's talk earlier about fairy tale about the incredible resurgence of rejigging of fairy tales to be as subversive as the originals, only with all of our understanding now of what's gone before and of our the influence of our own culture. Yes, it's absolutely possible.
The answer to your question is yes.
Yes, and possibly this is the way of the future for that kind of fantasy.
Yes, and it is also possibly what we're doing at the same time is that because we are approaching these from our own modern sensibilities, that we're taking all of that stuff that is in there and filtering it through our own lenses, which are necessarily of this era. So yes,
resoundingly
yes, and I want to read that story.
Actually, I think you were asked.
Yes.
Just wanted to comment on one of the things I really missed from modern tellings of Cinderella that I read in a very old French version. The moral at the end of the story is, and children, it's important for you to know, it doesn't matter how skilled or how beautiful you are, unless you have social connections, you won't get anywhere.
Not only social connections, tiny feet. Yeah. Cinderella is a very, I don't even need this thing because it's blowhard. And I'm talking about foot fetishes. The Cinderella, the moral of the Cinderella story, if you can actually find me a moral in that, she really doesn't actually get the prince because she's...
This was something I read in the story where they actually had the moral at the end of the story.
Yeah, and the moral is.
Yeah, I hate that. But those are versions of much earlier myths that then have things tacked onto them and pinned and made pretty. Peter's got it. I'm not answering that.
You're not answering that?
Yeah.
Dual will.
It's just a question.
It's just a question?
Yeah, no, I read a retelling of that story in a magazine of fantasy and science fiction back in the early 90s, and I was never sure whether or not it was essentially going back to the roots and telling it as it had always been intended, pre-Disney, or if it was in fact just a whole new feminist subversion of the story. So I thought I would ask, in this particular version, the stepsisters are, you know, hacking off their toes and stuff. So
That's the real story.
but they're doing it not because they're after the social connections, or not because they want to win, you know, social status, but because they love their sister so much, and they know that her relationship with the prince is going to be horrible, and they are willing to sacrifice themselves, even though Cinderella hates their guts. She's a spoiled little brat.
That is an absolute.
Who has no idea what she's letting herself into, because she has this bubble-headed view of life in the Disney castle. And her stepsisters are sacrificing themselves desperately to try and save this one innocent kid from from an absolutely horrific life of subservience to the prince.
I think we would have to defer to Daniel, but that seems to be like total.
Was that the original?
Total
Was that new, or was that
new? Yeah, we're only 10 minutes. Oh, okay. Although it sounds amazing.
That does sound amazing. It also sounds like an actual, like, complete subversion of it. And I think, and I would like to read it. And I would have liked to have written it. Actually.
I have actually, I have, because I haven't talked about my work in progress yet, which is actually a subversion of the Minotaur myth. And it's that kind of. I could not get anywhere with it. I had written 100 pages. It wasn't working. And then I made Ariadne a bitch. I made her a spoiled, petulant, sullen little spoiled princess, and all of a sudden the story completely worked, and it opened things up, because that kind of subversion, Ariadne, although there are many versions of all the myths we do know, mostly Ariadne is hard done by. She's a victim. She gives everything to the man, and the man leaves her on the next island, and it's all, oh, boo-hoo, poor Ariadne. And I thought, no, you know what? No. Why? The whole point about myths, and in fact about fairy tales, is they've been told for so long and by so many people and so far back that it's like Wikipedia, for example. When you go to any mythological references on Wikipedia, it'll say, well, this version of the myth says this, and then 300 years later, this version was very popular and it went back to an earlier myth. But who knows? Who knows? So I think this idea of subversion is kind of both inevitable and the point.
It wasn't really originally Lancelot. Originally, it was Bedivere. It was much cooler, by the way.
Her Bedivere was
hot. Bedivere's hot.
I remember that.
Again, with the attractive people in my head. Yes.
Does that mean that it's okay that they keep rewriting the entire Marvel and DC universes every few years?
Oh my God! Yes. Wait.
Yes. Have you read any of 52? It's fucking awesome.
Oh.
Cut that out of the. Yeah, my mother will be watching that. Sorry, Mom. Very excited.
Yes, there's some really amazing things that are coming out of that.
Aquaman is really cool.
Is it about not taking anything as canon? Is that really? I mean, in fantasy and science fiction, some people have trouble with this. It's about canon, and canon is static and unchanging, and we love it. But
canon, schmanon. I want my monkey boy. Listen, I think every generation, it's like every generation gets the DC universe they deserve. But also, which means that things are going to go horribly south for us shortly.
Which I don't know.
Yes, I know.
We read it.
No, this is the thing. I mean, it's not only just like, especially with comics, because you have so many different, the universe becomes so horribly bloated, and everything else. It is very much like the Norse myth. You have to burn that world to the ground and start over again, with sort of the same characters again, and because at some point, for a new audience, there is no entree into those stories anymore, and I think that it is like awesome that they're actually doing this. I mean, when they first did the whole Secret Wars thing, when I was a kid reading comic books at that time, I was like, hey, they're taking all of my comic characters and getting rid of them and starting up new ones for other people, and I was horrified. And then I started reading them again, and I was like, it's brand new, cool, I can read it again. And that's the thing that a lot of people who are raging against that particular machine are not getting, is that it actually is a renewal, and hopefully they will continue to do awesome things with it. bet even more awesome things with it. And they're off to a pretty good start. I got a little excited.
That was great.
Thanks. Yeah. Wait, there was one over here first, and then there was Hufflepuff. No, Gryffindor girl. You had your hand up originally. But wait, yes. Yes.
Yeah, I had her a while ago.
Okay. Just went over there somewhere.
Just the talking about fairy tales and the original versions and so on and so forth. It just there aren't original versions. We sort of got into that since then, but it's just.
Well, there isn't. It's probably a cave painting.
Yeah, it's probably a cave painting way back in the. But even saying, oh, if we subvert the original version's morals, are we doing something wrong or something? The people who wrote them down, the Grimm brothers wrote it down, Perrault wrote it down, and they had their own particular reasons that they wrote it down. They put their own morals into it. They put their own society's values into it. And so we're doing the same thing. Fairy tales all along have been about changing it for your own society, about telling your own society story through this story. And so it's not a radical difference that we're doing now.
So that means that you and the gentleman behind you actually get to have a knife fight now. Because that was good.
I think it's only radical given that we have both an inability to see too far into the future and a very blinkered concept of past. So for us, for example, Disney has really colored. I have 2 daughters, and yeah, I mean, thank God they're Hunger Games now, not Disney. But the way you qualify these forms for yourself, of course, are based entirely on the childhood, the cultural affiliations, and so it does seem like subversion, and that may be kind of naive to change those stories up. But at the same time, there's, as I spoke about being a point on a continuum earlier, it's quite lovely that we keep doing this, and even if we are blinkered about it and think we're probably more special than we are, I think that's the point of it.
I think it's also the purpose of these stories. I think, and that
transformation constantly.
Yes. That sort of brings it to a nice thingy. Are we okay if we?
And now there's a break, so anyone who wishes to
let's sew up the frog
and
put it back up to the leaf at that point. Thank you. You guys are fantastic.